Hey there, Tony here from Chronoforge Studios. In today's devlog, we'll be going over the new equipment I've implemented and how I set up Unreal's enhanced input system to route actions into Unreal's gameplay ability system that I set up for the game.
I spent last week working on 3 different pieces of equipment that would represent some of the different kinds of weapons the player would come across. The goal was to tie together all the different effects and tests I've been working on into a complete system to allow the player to switch between different pieces of equipment they've picked up. The initial design has it so the player will have 2 slots that you can put the equipment you find into, similar to Dead Cells. Equipment will be randomly spread throughout the levels, so you'll have to use unarmed combat or choking takedowns until you find better weapons. Once you have equipment, you can use the 1 or 2 key on the keyboard to switch between equipment slots, and when you do, the one you select will materialize using a special material effect I created. This effect is a bit costly performance-wise, so internally after the weapon has materialized, I swap it out for a performant version of the material that doesn't have the spawn effect. This is done by having 2 static mesh components and setting the visibility flag to true for the one that I want visible at any given time. For testing purposes, I increased the number of equipment slots the player can have to 6 and just added the dagger, pistol, and sword to the character as part of the player spawning. This will allow me to test the equipment slot system and get the initial sets working until I get to the point where I have equipment drops in the level you can acquire. The other visual element I added this week was the ability for weapons to reduce the glow when the player is stealthed. I did this to give the player another indicator that they have gone into the shadows, and it just feels visually better if weapons aren't super bright in the darkness to a degree that would be clearly noticeable by a guard passing by. I'm really liking the way these visuals turned out, but I still have a few more things to clean up. The first thing is I need to have the weapons disappear when you perform specific parkour movements, then have them return when you're on your feet again. I also wouldn't mind a despawn effect when you unequip a weapon or switch to another, but it looks pretty good as is, so I might hold off on that and leave it for a stretch goal. One of the biggest accomplishments this week was to finally incorporate the Unreal gameplay ability system test I've been working on into the game, and having the enhanced input system drive it. I've been wanting to get this working for a while since it's a much cleaner way to organize my code and lets me put my test code into proper abilities, including the stealth systems and perception. For now, I've just set up switching between equipment and activating abilities on equipment, but the framework is now in place to start adding other parts like specific attacks for the new weapon. According to the current design, each equipment will have 3 abilities tied to it, which include the primary ability, like shooting for a gun, a primary alternate ability, like aiming down the sights for a gun, and a secondary ability, like switching the gun mode. The default input is set up so that right-click is primary, left-click is primary alternate, and the X key is the current weapon's secondary. I also have it so the Q key is secondary for the equipment in the first slot, and the E key is the secondary for the second slot, regardless of what is actively equipped. It is set up in this way so that if your secondary does something like throw a bomb or activate some other useful gadget, you can do it without swapping equipment. I might break this up after playing around with it in game. So far I've been testing equipment individually, so now that I have things mapped correctly, I can start to test the pacing and generally get the game feel of the various equipment layouts and activation patterns. My goal is to get something that feels good to me and works with the rest of the design, then start to expand out my group of testers to refine it further. I've designed my system so that the player controller takes in all the actions and passes them to the various systems, but mostly the player character. The player controller has been set up to receive actions from the enhanced input system, which maps actions to specific keys that can be rebound at runtime. Once these actions are activated, they're routed into the player character, and the variables that come in from the action are passed along as well so that the player character can handle everything that's sent to it. Here I've defined the primary, secondary, and alt that I've spoken about before and pass them along. I also pass in the actions that are like for the unarmed specifically, if you want to go back to unarmed, and the different equipment slots, typically just 2. But I have, like I said, defined 6 of them for debugging for now. The player character will then take this input and pass it on to the current equipment. The player character receives actions from the player controller using custom events that trigger different functions on the character itself. There's 2 types of categories for these. The first is setting your active equipment, so you can select whether you want to be unarmed or use equipment slot 1 or equipment slot 2. So let's say you have a pistol and a dagger, so if you click number 1 on the keypad, then you would select your pistol, it would show, and then from there you could use it. Or if you hit 2, then your dagger would show and you can use that. Unarmed is always a default fallback if you don't have any equipment, or you're just starting up the game and spawning for the first time. The other thing you can do once you select your equipment is activate the equipment, which is the other actions that get pushed through into the character. Inside the character, what it does is see what your currently equipped thing is. So if you had selected 1 for your pistol, that's what would come through here, and then it would activate its primary, which is shoot. If there was a secondary, like let's say zooming in, then if you hit the other key, which is holding left click, then it would zoom in. And the final thing might be your secondary, which might, let's say, change the gun mode so that it fires differently or does homing or something like that. I also set it up so the character can receive these 2 other events for the first and second slot of your equipment, regardless of what you have equipped. Just in case, I want to make it so that you can use a secondary even though it's not actively showing. So that's how the player character receives events from the player controller. I also took some time to try and resolve an issue that occurs when the player is standing on a step. I wasn't able to solve this issue, but I think I know what I need to do to fix it, so that'll be one of the things I'll be working on next week. I also want to get to the choke animations I didn't get to this week, and start with the new attacks for the sword and dagger.
That's all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe, or join our newsletter using the link below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.